might as well try our best to get started on time here. My name's Zach Trolley. I'm going to be looking after the room this afternoon. So if there are any questions, comments, come tap me on the shoulder. If you're speaking up next, maybe just come have a quick chat with me so I know who you are, so I know what to be looking for. In the audience, we're going to be doing half an hour talks that will be happening very quickly, but there will be time at the end for questions. And of course, if you have really burning questions, I'm sure you could track down the speaker and ask them in the hallways or in the cafeteria and sit down and buy them a sandwich or a beer or whatever the occasion may be. But without much ado, Bruce, would you like to come on up and kick us off?
It's on. That's good. Yeah. All right. Thank you, folks, for coming to my little talk here. This is about the future of spaceflight. And I'm taking a different sort of approach to this, showing that there is reason to believe that self-organized critical systems are driving this process. And this is a big topic, but I wanted to give you, see if I could give you the flavor for it. Of course, this is kind of where it all started in my mind years ago when I started thinking about this. This is, of course, JFK, and that's Wernher von Braun, the leaders of the Apollo program in the early 60s. And it struck me the other night thinking about this, how odd that you should have a really affluent president who happens to be working with a technical expert who's not from this country. And I thought, I wonder if that could ever happen again. And you never know. It's a very subtle joke, and I won't explain it until later. But anyway, here is the other thing about this I should be sure that you understand. This talk is not about what I would like to happen, okay? This is not about what I would like to see happen in space. What I want to see in space is probably what you want to see, and that is, I want to see the biggest Mars colonization project possible leave yesterday and continue for decades, okay? That's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see the moon, the lunar polar ices looked at closely too, ideally by the US and a consortium of like ISS partners. That's what I want. But we're going to talk about here what I think is going to actually happen in that context. Here's where most of the talk is, but I'm going to, if I'm lucky, I'll be able to show you more than just this. We regard the US economy as being a complex system, and I'll show you and tell you a little bit more about this. The reason that's important is that things get really strange about twice per century. And you can document this, as we have, because these are times when there's very rapid growth that lasts for years. The 60s were a perfect example of this. That was the greatest economic boom of all time up to that time, and it changed the world. It wasn't just the US. Part of that change was the Apollo program. I know a well-known history professor who wrote a book, I don't want to give away this person's name, but about the 60s, and she and I are friends now, didn't make any mention of the Apollo program. And I didn't know that was even possible. See, I'm wired differently, but we're friends, we even talk now. Anyway, the guy who started this off physically was Per Bach, the famous Brookhaven physicist who sort of invented the concept of self-organized criticality, which is about having a critical system. It could be anything, by the way. And this subject is very popular among people looking for explanations for all sorts of things. The astrophysicists love it because they like to talk about solar flares being critical systems that reach critical states. People in the financial business have looked at critical systems and see critical times in financial systems that can go both ways, either a bad time or a good time. Of course, the geophysicists love it because they characterize how earthquake works, and it just goes on and on and on, okay? Even wars now are considered to be, by some people, critical systems. It's a pretty scary thought when you really think about it, but that's relevant to this whole thing. So anyway, this has been going on for 30 years, seeing how critical systems affect real life, and that's what this is about. I think it plays a really important role in the space program. I think it's playing a really important role now, and the whole idea is to try to look at the last 200 years when we've had these pulses of activity separated by roughly 50 years, of which the last one was the 60s when we had Apollo, and I think we're going into one now, and I'll try to show you why that is. But let me give you the basic thing about this talk right here. And then we can fill in anything you want by turning the page here in a minute. The first thing you see in these are called Maslow windows, named after Abraham Maslow, the mid-20th century psychologist who developed this idea about a Maslow hierarchy. And early geopolitical avalanches, the word avalanche means something that happens quickly during a critical state and has system-wide implications. It's a big deal, in other words. And the avalanches goes along with the metaphor of per back, which I'm going to show you in a few minutes. So save your question on that. But the word avalanche is a generic term that means something really special, good or bad, that happens during a critical state. That's the way you should think about it now. Anyway, early in the Maslow window, these things are generally a decade long, but it can be plus or minus. What happens is some sort of a terrible thing like a Sputnik Moment. If you remember this or you've ever read about it, it was called the shock of the century. And what happened was that Russia secretly launched the first tiny little satellite. And when people saw that going over, they thought their lives were over. Okay, I was alive then, but I was like that tall. So I don't remember that much about it. But when you read about it, it was a shock. Believe it or not, the K through 12 school system got blamed for it, among other things. And the second thing was more serious. That's the Cuban Missile Crisis, which has implications for today because people, see, there are dark sides of this, but I have to get into it, so I hope you're patient with me. People talk about the North Korea situation and actually call it, quote, a Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. Okay, because remember, the real Cuban Missile Crisis lasted roughly 2 weeks. It was very, very quickly. That one could have led to World War III. This one could too, but it won't, based on this model. Okay, and in fact, I expect a solution very much like what happened in the 60s for a variety of reasons. But what's interesting is this is what gets the public interested in space. When you're affluent and you just won World War II, you don't have a care in the world. And all of a sudden, this happened and shocked the country. Okay, so that's what that's about. I'm going to talk about what could be the Sputnik moment for today, although it's not as easy to specify as it sounds. There are economic avalanches. Remember, avalanches is a generic term. There is going to be a major economic boom. Kennedy produced one in the early 60s. It's called the JFK boom. It was unparalleled at that time. Prior to these booms, there's usually a financial panic. There was a financial panic in 2008 that's famous. I see that as the clear precursor of the new Maslow window, which we're basically just entering right now. And as you'll see, the thing that we are waiting for to set this whole thing off, to complete the pattern. By the way, all the ducks are lined up, and that's what I'm showing you here, some of the ducks. The only duck that isn't lined up is the major economic boom, and if you follow financial news, you know that we're right on the edge of that too. Nothing's happened in Washington, and yet people are ready to take off on a major economic boom. It's an amazing thing. I didn't expect that to happen. Not that I would have expected it anyway. Now the boom is important because it's not just, in fact, the smallest part of it is that it provides the money for the architecture elements that you need to go to Mars or wherever you want to go. It really is important because it makes people exuberant. And what happened during the 60s, the word we use is ebullient. What happened in the 60s is unemployment dropped to nearly zero and real wages across the board from top to bottom went up. And so for the first time, many people were getting ahead, had never had that experience before, and so their whole life changed. And this is what's the Maslow hierarchy comes in. This whole hierarchy thing says that if you're very poor, you're worried about, you have physiological needs like where you're going to have lunch and stuff like that, or if you're going to be alive. As you get a little more affluent, you start to think about what you're going to do with your life. You start to think about how you can interact better with other people, and you begin to be concerned about the big picture, including things like what's out there, why should people want to go to places like Mars and the Moon. This is the way that support is generated among the general public. And it works really well as long as this boom is happening. When the boom begins to collapse, so does this feeling of ebullience. Now, by the way, there are lots of, ebullience means like you've had a glass and a half of champagne. You're extremely optimistic, maybe too much so. And if you read books by historians about the 60s, my favorite is called The Liberal Hour by Mackenzie and Weisbrot. It was almost a Pulitzer Prize-winning book. They call the 60s a time of, quote, an epidemic of optimism. Think about that expression. Think about that for a second. And that's what we were at. And if you remember LBJ, was his rhetoric before 1966 was we're going to cure the poor, we're going to cure diseases, solve poverty, bring peace to the world. And he was serious. And it's that kind of ebullient feeling that you know, if you've never experienced it, I can't describe it any better than that. If you remember Walter Cronkite used to do the old space launches, it was during the Apollo 11 launch, he was live on the air, he said something like, you know, after the launch of Apollo 11, everything else in history will be an asterisk. I mean, that's ebullience. I mean, when you think of all the things he just included in that paragraph. So, and there was a guy who was very worldly and knew about how things worked, and here he is so taken, so blown away by Apollo 11 that that's what we mean by ebullience. That is beginning to actually happen. Once that occurs, then money is no object. And in the beginning, by the way, of the Apollo program, nobody knew how much the Apollo program was going to cost, and nobody even cared. And it wasn't until about 1963 that the New York Times said, you know, maybe we ought to try to figure out how much this is going to cost. And that was kind of like, you know, sorry to bring it up, but it's not that important really, but maybe just for the record. And if you can imagine that mindset, that tells you you're in a different sort of world psychologically. And that's when these great human explorations like Apollo, and as we get deeper into this in a few years, you're going to see things like manned Mars, human spaceflight to Mars and so forth, and maybe back to the moon, as well as these MEPs. I differentiate the explorations from the MEPs. That's a macro engineering project, by the way, such as the Panama Canal. People love big engineering projects. They love them. And the bigger and the more expensive they are, the more they love them. And which is, some people will wonder, well, if that's true, why didn't people love the ISS? And the answer is, they never saw it. Okay? They never had a chance to see it. So they like to see things that they get excited about, things they can see that are big and exciting and complex. Okay? And the Panama Canal was probably the most extraordinary MEP in modern history until Apollo came along. Okay? You guys with me? Sort of? Now I'm going to turn the page and try to fill in a few details here. We're doing okay on time. This is this is really the mystery that got me hooked on this topic, and I've been trying to explain this to myself for many years. Freeman Dyson was speaking in Chicago at the ISDC in 2010. I happened to be there, and this was a dinner meeting, so we were all sitting around relaxed, and he said, why have we been stuck in low Earth orbit for 40 years? And I thought, geez, that's a really good question. But he didn't answer it. He was just posing it. And then he went on with this talk. And I thought, you know, is there a bigger question than this? I mean, this really is the question. Why haven't we gone back to the moon in 40 years? And the little preview I gave you before should begin to hint to you a little bit why we haven't done it. It's because things that drive these programs simply weren't lined up the way they have to be lined up to make it actually happen. And I started thinking about this when I used to work with General Dynamics, and I'd go to NASA headquarters and fly all the way back to San Diego. There's a lot of time to think. And you go to these meetings, and they would ask me questions like, why do you think we should be sending humans in space? And I'm thinking, wait a minute, this is NASA headquarters. You're supposed to be telling me that. So you know, they were kind of putting it on me. So then I get back to San Diego, and I go into the director's office, and he'd look at me and say, Bruce, why should we be sending humans into space? And I said, I feel like a ping pong ball, you know, going back and forth between NASA and my management. So this is a key question about why we haven't done this. We had the capability. It could have been resurrected. It will be resurrected now. Okay. This is the way we were. It's hard for young people to imagine that this actually occurred sometimes. This is an old slide of mine from General Dynamics, but it really, it's an odd point of view, I admit. It's a Mars point of view. It shows stuff happening. I have a pointer somewhere, but it doesn't matter. There it is right there. It shows stuff happening on the moon. There it is right there. And it even shows operations on the surface, but the real interest at this time, some years ago, notice how large Phobos and Deimos are in this chart. Clearly not to scale, friends, in case you're wondering. So maybe psychologically to me they were to scale, because my whole point of departure here was that these are the places to start Mars exploration for a whole number of reasons. They're easy to get to. The delta V's, the energy requirement is every 2 years it's less than the surface of our moon. A lot of people don't realize that. So if you pick your years correctly, it's easy to get there. They have very low gravities, and yet they're not zero gravity. So you rendezvous with these things, you don't land on them. There's a good chance they're wet, so they could become propellant depots. I could go on. By the way, if you want to do Mars science, and everybody does, put your fleet of robotic rovers on the surface of Mars and direct them in real time from Phobos. And then you don't have planetary contamination concerns as much, assuming Mars is not already contaminated. But these issues keep coming up. But anyway, I still think if you want to do a near-term program for relatively little money, by the way, and low risk, because you don't need a lander to go down to the surface to do this program right away. So the idea would be send your astronauts to Phobos and Deimos and develop your lander, and then when you decide to go down, have the lander sent to Phobos and Deimos and do your exploration on Mars. That was my Phobos Deimos commercial. I hope you'll forgive me. It's not really related to the talk here, so I feel better now. Now, here's the big picture, and this is sort of a rehash of what we did on the preview page, but this is something that comes up. I don't know if you run into people who talk about this. They feel that Apollo's timing was an accident. It was a fluke. It'll never happen again. There's no way to understand how it happened before. And what this talk is about is to completely show that that's not the case. There was nothing fluky about it. It was perfectly predictable. And the fact that we're going into another 1960s style decade, which, by the way, folks, is both good and bad, okay, as you'll see downstream. I'm almost out of time. I'm going to go past this one, and there we go. This is the details about how complex systems work. What you see in the real world is results in this whole complex systems thing, results in pulse activity. This is like the 60s, separated by decades of relative inactivity. Okay, and that's a significant thing, because that basically describes what we've experienced. Here he is, friends. This is Per Bach, the physicist. Here's a remnant. He's no longer with us, by the way, passed away very prematurely. And here's the whole idea of the Bach sand pile. You drop a grain of sand on the sand pile, grain by grain. Eventually it builds up slopes to the point where one more grain has the potential for causing a huge avalanche. There's where the term comes from. And the avalanche in the sand pile is a real physical avalanche. But the avalanche in economic terms is a metaphorical avalanche. But the idea is once you're in the critical state with the high slopes, speaking metaphorically again, the next grain has the potential to do something system-wide in terms of system-wide changes. And that would correspond to a large program like Apollo or a large MEP like the Panama Canal. And so that's why we tend to see these things during times of criticality. And that's what it means to refer to these things as avalanches. Does that make sense, sort of? Okay. And this actually, by the way, I'm not going to talk about it, but this is the kind of data that people use to show that, for example, large wars are also complex systems that obey these same sort of statistical laws. Okay, here's the sort of data that shows that there are these pulses that are about twice per century, because we see these sorts of things clustering together about every 55 or so years. It is about twice per century. Here, the 1960s were a transformative time, but it was also a time of ebullience. Remember the epidemic of optimism we were talking about before? And here are two of the people why. You don't just run into people like this every day. Disney and von Braun working together. I'm going to go over that. If you want to think about the 60s as a critical state, it had almost everything. It had great things, it had bad things, It had important things. It had things that were sort of incidental to what was going on at the time. And the interesting thing is this quote from Yale sociologist Gary Brewer, who points out that during Apollo, NASA was, quote, a perfect place. Isn't that a wonderful quote? I'm going to have to go on. Here's data that shows that there really is these twice per century clusters. This is us back in 1987 wondering why we didn't have a big space program. I didn't know why then, but it's because the economy crashed. I mean, the markets crashed in 1987. There was no recession, but it meant the economy was still on its way down. You don't have big space programs under that situation. This is 2007 on the cover of Fortune, the greatest economic boom ever. And the next year was the panic of 2008. And the irony of that, this is the way complex systems work. Very rapidly, very abruptly. They're hard to predict. And we're likely to go back into this type of boom very shortly. Wouldn't surprise me to see it happen within a year or so, or if not sooner. This is a case study I can't tell you about. Here's the remaining final step. Oh, but if you knew about it, you'd love it, because it's the early 20th century Maslov window that shows exactly the sort of growth that we expect to see now. That's why I threw it in there. This is the final step. What do we need to see before we get a big space program? We need to see the JFK style boom. And the amazing thing, all of this stuff is well known. The technological state of our country is tremendous. It's poised, it's queued, it's ready to go. But what's really surprising is the growing optimism. We were talking about this earlier. The markets had been near record levels for a long time, for the last several months. And surveys, consumer surveys, CEO surveys, almost everybody surveyed, for some reason feels growing optimism, and it's quite a thing. And yet nothing has happened in terms of lowering taxes yet. These people are just anticipating it. This is when people get close to a 60s style decade, they start to get pre-ebullience. They start to get ebullient before there's even any reason to, because they're anticipating. Can you imagine what will happen if they actually do lower taxes on businesses? It'll be like the 60s, only better. That's my prediction, but that's a pretty easy prediction. Everybody else says that too, so I'm just repeating what they say. And let's see, finally, this is Bridenstine, and this is a NASA chart right here. And it looks like they're looking at the moon in the 2020s and Mars in the 2030s. And he likes lunar polar waters too, which is a good thing. This is a pretty loose plan, let's face it. There really isn't any obvious goal. It's not clear why the station is required for this, but still, this is giving you NASA's, at least at the moment, snapshot of how they see the timeline working now. It doesn't seem to be impossible to me to actually run both of these programs at once. If you do the lunar one internationally, and if you do a lower cost human mission or initiative to Phobos, those things could actually run together without being... Remember, in the early 60s, nobody cared what things cost. So if we get to that point, it won't matter. You know, we'll run both programs because they're both exciting. Here's the... I'm almost done. Yeah. Are you okay?
Yeah.
I don't want you to get angry. Now, not when we're going to get to the Sputnik moment. This is the big thing. The question is, see, Sputnik moments are not good things. So I just want you to remember that. The last one was scary for everybody. And there was a lot of finger pointing at everybody. But the question is, will there be another Sputnik moment? And Sputnik moments are mainly for engaging the public in large, not people like us at meetings like this, but the public at large, to bring them into contact with what's happening in space that's related to their security. Okay. And Bridenstine has suggested that lunar polar ices might somehow be a Sputnik moment. That would require people to understand some complex things about how they could be used. I agree that it is strategic, but I don't think most people are aware of it. Okay. And what's more likely is the Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion in North Korea is going to be, my guess is, having no inside context on this, my guess is this will be resolved in an analogous way to the way the 60s one was actually resolved. How did the Cuban Missile Crisis get resolved in the 60s? Cuba was denuclearized. Okay, the Russians took their missiles and went home. How is it possible that could happen with the Cuban Missile Crisis in North Korea? And the answer is yes. I don't expect to see any significant military stuff going on here. And if you know anything about this situation, I mean, this is really a hair trigger waiting to happen, okay? So there's nothing anybody can do except wind this thing down carefully. You know, China's activities on and near the moon should have scared us to death a long time ago, because they're very aggressive in terms of their program, which is, by the way, I'm all for aggressive space programs from China and Russia and anybody else who wants them, because that'll get us more engaged. That's how it works. And that's what happened in the Cold War the first time. And now that we're basically entering a Cold War the second time, that's what you can expect. Here's the summary. We made it to the last page. And just to remind you, this is sort of a summary of the preview page, if you remember that a long time ago. This is suggesting that the next decade will be analogous to the 60s and the early 20th century, when we went through all these things related to complex systems. By the way, there will be a termination to this. When you hear about space programs in the 2030s, big space programs in the 2030s, that would be like a big space program in 1985 or something like that. Just unlikely to happen. And the reason is we'll be on the downswing. Now, the nice thing about, the way to get around this is to build an outpost somewhere like on the moon or on Phobos and have enough self-sufficiency that they don't need to visit all the time, but still this would keep us in the deep space business. If we don't do that, we could be in for another 40-year hiatus. Nobody will admit this, but I mean, nobody wanted to admit the one that just happened either. So this is a dangerous thing to worry about. If you're wondering, does any of this really connect with reality? And the answer is, this is the nastiest type of reality there is. These systematics I told you about, twice per century, critical states, which are called Maslow windows, have operated very robustly for the last 200 years through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, several financial panics. I left out the Civil War. This thing is not going to go away in the next decade. It's going to continue robustly. And that's basically it. Yeah, that's just about me. Now, I'm sure nobody has any questions. I answered all your questions. Do you want me to pick people? Or
Yeah, if you want to pick your...
That gentleman right there.
Maslow's ideas are based on a technological world that does not exist anymore. The speed at which things are changing in the communications are orders of magnitude bigger than they were when this. Does this compress the cycle?
This whole system is being compressed. You brought up a good point, because if you look at the whole model, obviously the faster communication gets, the changes, think of the Maslow window, just to pick an example. In 1957, just seeing a satellite going over was enough to upset the country. But it took the Soviet Union a few years to perfect ICBMs until they could actually do a Cuban Missile Crisis. Now you can have both together, just to get back to your point. Now, specifically about Maslow, I don't think human nature has changed. So people that are not expecting a shock or not expecting, for example, there are lots of examples I can think of, but I don't want to go there right now. There are lots of bad things that could happen right now associated with the North Korea situation. And you can think of them probably better than I can, or at least as well. And nobody believes any of those things are going to happen. Imagine if they did. See, that's the sort of a shock, and I don't even want to get into those scenarios. Go ahead. Go ahead.
What would somebody like Elon Musk throw into it, or the space elevator coming up?
Thank you for bringing that up. That was the answer to the initial joke about could an affluent president work with a technical expert from another country? And I'm thinking about the current one along with Musk. And I think, see, that's what's, gee, nobody would have gotten that joke if you hadn't brought that up. Anyway, it's good. But, I mean, Elon Musk has, at least the last time I checked, real interest in sending people to Mars in the mid-2020s. Those are, I think, still serious dates. And he's going to get there 10 years before NASA does, if that works out. So working with NASA in this context, where you have a country leading this program, to me is a very refreshing thing. I mean, I feel the same things everybody else feels. I'd love the U.S. government to have a tremendous space program like this, but the trouble is, after a 40-year hiatus, wow. I haven't lost faith. I'm just not as enthusiastic about the notion anymore. Go ahead.
You know, two areas in the last century were actually reversed. The Depression, which had massive public works projects, the Hoover Dam, Boulder Dam, Tennessee Valley Authority, were at a time in the Depression where there was no hope. People were not ebullient. And then Kennedy, which was a more ebullient time, as you say, both of them, leadership is left out. So you can have the best times if you don't really have people connecting, or a leader connecting with the people, leading the way. It's
Oh, I
almost
agree.
yeah.
In the 60s, you're right. We had JFK. In the first, the driving force supporting the Panama Canal was Theodore Roosevelt, that kind of a guy. And so, Lewis and Clark, you had Thomas Jefferson. So pretty good people. And the question, I don't know if you're getting into a political area here or not. Do we have that kind of material in the administration now? That's a matter of opinion. I wrote an op-ed on this, actually, that relates to this summer. And the answer that I had was maybe. Nobody can predict the future. Am I done?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.